So next up and last up on this session would be Katie McDonough, who has been very much our team leader in this whole project. Katie's going to talk about using text and on maps for research. Katie is a lecturer in digital humanities at Lancaster University, and she's a senior research fellow at the Alan Turing Institute in London. She's trained as a historian of 19th century France here at Stanford, and most recently has been a member of the Living with Machines project and the UK PI of Machines Reading Maps, both of which are based at the Turing Institute. So Katie, up to you.
Thank you so much. It's hard to follow after so many amazing presentations, and we've already learned so much today. But I'm going to really kind of take a step back and kind of come up to a higher altitude as well. So bigger, broader, to really think about how what we're doing with text on maps relates to previous scholarship, and then therefore what the opportunities can be. And I'm going to say a little bit more about the use case that Valeria mentioned with antiquities. So I just want to begin, actually, I don't want to distract you with that yet. So I just want to begin, by saying that maps are quite different from other texts, other written documents. They consist of a combination of visual features with text, numbers, and other symbols that have been added for different kinds of explanatory power. Interpreting their rhetorical messages requires accounting for new kinds of agents who are involved in their creation or reproduction. And more fundamentally, it can be hard to interact with maps because it's simply difficult to find the ones that are relevant to a given investigation, hence the importance of transforming discovery. So maps are often not even cataloged in as much detail as books, pamphlets, and archival documents. And the David Rumsey collection is a real exception to that. And we're incredibly lucky to be able to have the chance to work with maps that have such rich, detailed item level metadata. So scanning maps or digitizing them at the document level gained momentum in libraries and archives in the 90s and continues. And David, of course, was a real innovator in the scanning of historical maps. And this digitization waves are a real opportunity for researchers like me to kind of rethink the status quo, rethink how we can work with these materials. So digitization encouraged people to develop new strategies for looking at maps, from moving from the reading room table to a set of screens, literally something like this, which opens a creative space for imagining new ways of interacting with multiple maps at once. For example, as superimposed layers in a GIS, or just one map really big, as many of the presenters have shown you today. So nevertheless, even with digitized collections, celebrated for improving access to rare items and for reducing the cost of research trips, the habit of thinking with one map at a time has still really held fast. And so humanities projects that engage with scanned maps really still use GIS to work with maps in quite small batches. But now there are hundreds of thousands of maps that have been scanned around the world. I think almost 1 million maps. I tried to count once. It's very hard to count these things. Actually, that would be a lovely little project to do with librarians. But it's impossible for one pair of eyes to see so many maps with an analytical perspective. So how can we move beyond simply digitizing images and uniting disparate collections to ask questions about the content of these new, very large corpora? What do we need to do to turn digital images of historical maps into interpretable data for research across disciplines, but including the humanities? So after the 1990s, soon looking at maps on screens shifted to the idea that we could extract map data from maps. So map content could become fodder for the growing repositories of geospatial data around the world. And this sort of second wave of digitization, creating discrete structured data from maps rather than treating the sheet as one digital object, raised a new set of obstacles and opportunities. And data from maps really, as you've heard before, needs to be critically created and curated. It needs to be thought about in relation to other sources. And it's really at this point that the question for researchers became, should we spend time on manual data creation, where we can have more of a critical eye that we're trained to do by working with one map at a time? Because, well, now we have these really amazing computer vision and machine learning tools. So we need to learn how to work with them. So the idea that we're learning to work with map content at scale is really one of the exciting next frontiers in working computationally with collections as data. And because of these different waves of digitization and new developments in computer vision and machine learning, historians and really all researchers, and not just researchers, but anyone who wants to engage with these maps, are now able to reimagine what we ask of maps. So with that, I'm going to take a little dive into some scholars who have thought about this. But keeping in mind, again, you've seen a bunch of presentations that have walked you through our workflow, from deciding what collections to work with, to processing them with Map Curator, learning to search them in the Luna interface, the different ways that we're able to annotate and enrich the data. And now what I'm really talking about is this next step of, okay, we've got all this information. We've got a toolkit for learning to see it and engage with it. How can we analyze? What do we need to keep in our mind as we start to think about analysis of this data? And again, you've heard a little bit about the number of maps we've processed, but I just wanted to give you a little bit more of a sense of what are we actually talking about here. So some basic insights into the corpus are that this is, again, just the subset of the Rumsey corpus that was geo-referenced. So it's about 56,600 maps that were published between 1540 and 2017. So a hugely diverse collection. There are over 4,000 different people recorded in the metadata as creators of these maps. There's over 140 different types of map publications, for example, case maps or sheet maps or different kinds of atlases. These maps were published in over 1,000 places around the world. And they describe the landscapes of even more parts of the world, which are defined in different metadata fields. And then finally, we end up with the Map Curator output, which in the version 2 data is almost, as you heard, almost 100 million. So 92.5 million labels from maps. And honestly, just figuring out how to work with this data is one of the real challenges. And we're going to show you some hands-on examples of how to do that in the workshop tomorrow. So please come if you're interested in that. All right, so maps as texts. In 1990, the really exceptional historian of cartography who I first read as an undergrad and then just never stopped thinking about maps and the history of maps. In 1990, he wrote this great chapter called Text and Context. And this is, he has this approach to working with maps as texts that really drove home the point that maps use sign systems just as other texts do. So he calls attention to the graphical nature of map language and goes on to explain that one of the key approaches to analyzing maps as texts is through the study of toponyms. Place names, he wrote, offer a way of constructing genealogies and source profiles for previously scattered maps. But what of other uses of text on maps, which we've just seen several great examples? This first assumption that Harley makes that the only significant text is what can be defined as formal place names means that all text that A, describes the object of the map itself, such as its title, or B, indicates the location of non-toponymic places or sort of unnamed entities. All of that is kind of ignored in this framework he's setting up. So while Harley's scholarship broke ground in its time for opening up the history of cartography to the linguistic turn, and we have work like this for setting up future scholars to examine the rhetoric of maps, the politics of mapping, and the need to read maps contextually alongside other maps and primary sources. All of this has been widely adopted as intellectual moves for understanding maps. And he was not alone in writing easily about this task of let's go read maps. Yet this practice of reading was really only partially engaged with the actual text on the maps, this linguistic content. So what I want to do is ask us to kind of take seriously this idea. The premise behind machines reading maps was that we're actually going to go and read the text on the maps and figure out how to think with it and how to work with it as really structured text data that is also spatial data. So I'm going to highlight 3 steps or 3 sort of moves that I think are really important for keeping in our minds. And these are coming from scholars in the digital humanities and history and geography, some of whom are in the room, to propose some opportunities for analyzing text on maps. And then using these as a kind of foundation, you'll see how they've informed the case study on antiquities that we're working on. So the first is the wonderful scholar, Joanna Drucker, who works a lot on sort of getting us to think about visual information in the digital humanities. And then this great article that she wrote in 2011, she's really kind of grappling with the idea of whether we should even talk about data at all. Nicole has written extensively about this. And so there's this idea that actually we're not working with data, we're working with capta. And a really kind of crucial part of that definition is this idea that, of course, knowledge is constructed, it's taken, it's not simply given as a natural representation of pre-existing fact. And the little example here from our search of, well, on maps, historical sites are sometimes named, or ruins or other kinds of things that are actually being defined by surveyors. You can't walk on the ground here and there's not a little sign that tells you this is, well, it might tell this is a historical site, but that again, right, is a kind of constructed piece of knowledge. So I feel like holding this is in your mind is step 1. Step 2 is sort of the follow on, the kind of next generation from Harley's work is the really exceptional book that recently came out from the historian of cartography, Matthew Edney, who of course is one of the editors of the History of Cartography project. And he is basically developed the idea that we need to think about maps as part of a process, right? So the processual approach to maps. And he writes that maps are not just graphic images or things, but are variously integrations of words, graphics, numbers, and gestures. And the consideration of the myriad ways in which maps are consumed indicates that map reading is an intertextual practice, is as intertextual a practice as any other kind of reading. And readers require an understanding of the cultural context to interpret any map. No map can be understood except by reference to other texts and cultural forms. The real echoes back to Harley here. I really like this last sentence in this passage, that maps are best understood as works in progress. And I think that we have really taken on this ethos in machines reading maps and in seeing the data that we're creating as always a work in progress, always something that where we're interrogating the methods, we're interrogating the results, we're interrogating what it would mean to work with this. And indeed, our ambition here is to not sort of think of text on maps independently of other information, but in conjunction with it. And I really like this example of one of the many amazing maps, kind of railway related maps in the Rumsey collection, where we can see that text on maps is part of a process of communicating to people how they can use trains, right? So this is part of a process of understanding transportation infrastructure, but from a cartographical perspective, it's also part of a process because a map like this could be underlying data in a data set about passenger railway stations for the United States. So we want to think about this idea of maps as always being works in progress, understanding them in context and thinking about the intertextual nature of maps. So finally, I hesitated to do this because I thought I might say something that Karen might want to say later in the roundtable, but I couldn't resist because as Martin Lewis and Karen Wiggins' work in their 1997 book, The Myth of Continents, A Critique of Metageography, asks, there's a really important aspect of really thinking about the limits of problematic, overly taxonomic approaches to the organization of geographical space, which often happens on documents like maps. And so they really advocate that we need to historicize the categories through which we think about the world, through words like Europe and Asia, et cetera. So if Lewis and Wiggin thought carefully about these metageographies, how can we continue to unpick their pasts and reimagine their futures? It seems really equally important now that we can examine vast quantities of maps quickly with computational methods to also consider kind of other scales of geographic terms and naming patterns. So furthermore, as they pointed out in the book, we don't really we didn't then know, sort of pre-digital tools, the full extent to which metageographies operate on cartographic materials for all periods, for all parts of the world that have been mapped. So do all maps perpetuate metageographical myths? Where do patterns break? So while we'll never have a total digital archive of all maps ever produced, we can really begin to explore these questions with very large corpora whose collection provenance is documented to answer these questions in new ways. So what steps can we take then to practically embrace these ideas as we pursue research? We want to think about linking text to semantic information. You've already heard about how we're starting to try to do that, whether that's provided by experts, by specific communities, or is predicted by a machine. We want to examine the graphical information embedded in text and maps alongside its literal meaning. So coming back to the question of fonts that Valeria mentioned. And we want to differentiate between text that describes a map versus its content. And indeed, the content that explicitly names things versus sort of unnamed types. So these are all relevant, but we want to really be able to differentiate between these kinds of information. And here you can see just me starting to think with the data just purely from one sheet, from one of the Cassini sheets here in the collection. So the underlying map, you can see a little bit of the forest peeking through there, is there, so I can see the original text. And then I've just loaded in the map curator results for this particular text, and the coloring is based on the confidence score of the detection. So I can start to think about what is the quality of this result? Can I work with this? Are there bits that maybe need improvement before I feel comfortable working with this data, or am I good to go? And these detection confidence scores are actually not a useful parameter for thinking about trustworthiness. I keep pressing the wrong arrow. Okay, great. So, all right. So I just want to dive into these practical steps, and then I'll be wrapping up. So in terms of creating semantic information, Yao mentioned earlier, and Valeria mentioned as well, that we're really keen to think about sort of domain-specific semantic types for information on maps. And Valeria and I spent a very long time trying to think about how we could create something that was so basic that it might apply to a whole lot of maps and not just ordnance survey maps of 19th century Britain. Now, this is kind of a fool's errand, and we acknowledge that, but we wanted to at least attempt to make a proposition which could then be challenged and critiqued and worked over in many ways. And the idea here is to really start by defining the difference between an entity itself, say the footprint of a building, the label that describes that entity, And then maybe symbols that are a bit different from sort of literal representations of entities. And here you can see that arrows and circles and things like that are just purely symbolic value. Then we want to know what kind of label are we working with? Are we working with a named entity? Are we working with a generic type, an unnamed entity, or something else, right? There's a lot of other here. And then there was like a third level of semantic information that's already been mentioned, and of course, very common to really think about, well, is this word describing a kind of area, like a parish or a county, or et cetera, a continent? Is it a building name? Is it a street name or other kind of transportation infrastructure name? Is it referring to a natural feature, or is it something else, other? So starting from here, we wanted to really begin to apply these semantic labels, at first just manually, to the antiquities on Ordnance Survey maps and to other, well, all the text on Ordnance Survey maps, and then understand the relationship between named and unnamed entities, the types of features. Are they areas? Are they buildings? Are they streets, et cetera? And these antiquities-specific fonts. And we were really excited to work with this data because the maps that you're looking at here, these 19th century Ordnance Survey maps, were really created right at the time when professional practices for archaeologists and historians are developing, and they're really beginning to think about what it means to name a site and where to locate it. And I think that is a really important moment, right, of this sort of professionalization that's captured in the maps. And our aspiration, of course, then is to think outside the map, to think intertextually, to compare these sites that are named and described on the OS maps with modern heritage data sets coming from places like historic England, where we can understand then potentially the changes that have been made over time, either to the way that names are, the way that sites are named, to the period that they're supposed to represent, or if they've disappeared altogether. And so it's a really interesting opportunity to think about the bias in both 19th century maps and modern data sets around the inclusion and exclusion and description of history, right, of time on maps, I might say. And we're really excited to begin to think about that, how that relates to the semantic information about the type of place. So I'm going to wrap up there by just saying that the Antiquities Project is a work in progress. We're very excited to keep working on it and to expand beyond the OS maps to other maps that are really doing very interesting things to represent historical sites, even if not with different fonts. And I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you to David Rumsey, to say thank you to everyone at Stanford Libraries who helped organize this conference, in particular, Stace and Nicole and the whole Rumsey Center staff. It's been a dream to come back for this. I think we're all very happy to be here. And it's just been an amazing opportunity to work with you this year. So thank you. Yeah.
I think at this point, there are probably questions. I know there are some questions online, so we'll begin to field questions. Are there any questions in-house that you have for the speakers? We'll start with the in-house question.
Barry Smith, two questions to Valeria. One is, with the searches of things like lake, does it do it across languages? So if you search on lake, does it do Lago and everything? Okay.
I envision it, being quite accessible to, go beyond that, or with the name entity. So things like the people of London, and that idea is to see the people able to work around the different gathering. because they prefer the same identifier. So in the search, it's really that I think to advocate that it's unnamed application. I don't know. I think that would be really complicated.
And the second part question, I was curious after you pointed out looking by the fonts. Is there a way that you can search on font types to explore where those get used across the whole collection?
Not at the moment. I don't know if. No, thank you. Actually, I wanted to check if Yaoi and the team and maybe Gina, do you want to say something about the fonts?
Yeah, so for the font styles, we have been like developing and improving the spotter models to address like different font style to like better recognize the text labels, because a lot of different scan maps have different styles. So that's the way how we constructed the synth map. So we like manually define the styles that we what kind of like styles that we could have on this syntactic map to be trained on the model.
So let's go for a question that's online. And the first question is, how were the 4 different language groups determined for the new models?
Thank you for the question. This is an online question.
Yes.
Okay. Where's the camera?
It's
So, okay. So I know it's when we look at grouping languages, many different disciplines will have different ideas on how to group languages, right? But now we are actually talking about writing systems. We are looking at character sets. And we're looking at data-driven machine learning system that will be able to spot this text. So data-driven means we show the machine all these character sets. We hope the machine will be able to pick up some features. Right? So purely data-driven, the machine doesn't really know the relationship between all these language writing systems. It doesn't really care. But we believe if we make the model include more domain knowledge, it would be able to do better, make sure that it cares about all these languages. But so far, the way we split them is based on the character sets. So if those character sets look similar, and empirically we tested on it and it will be able to pick up similar signals to have good results, we put them in the same group. So I know, long answer for short.
We have another question in-house. Sure.
So for those people who aren't paying close attention to URLs, when might we see this capability online on the main David Rumsey site?
That's a Drake question.
I wish I could tell you. No, honestly, we're hoping early summer, but we have to scale it. We got to see where we can make sure that it can handle all the queries, and also that make sure that we have the latest data set too. We want that the latest data. So those 2 things are kind of where it's at. And again, it's a hope, and we'll work towards that. And so we're hoping early summer.
Drake, hold on to the the microphone there, because we have more questions from online, and I think this one would be for you and David. Are the extracted labels and associated metadata, IIIF manifests, et cetera, available as open data, and have they been categorized, e.g. as toponyms or not? I ask because extracted toponyms would one day make a wonderful addition to the World Historical Gazetteer. Yeah. And yeah, like there's a half dozen people in here who know exactly who asked that question.
Although it would be great if you want to add something about the IIIF. Yeah, but yeah, basically well, for the Rumsey data, the metadata for the corpus that we've analyzed is now up on Stanford Digital Repository. So that's just the georeference corpus, and the data output for the version 1, which is actually not what you're searching here now. This is version 2 that's currently searchable in the clone website, is also up in Stanford Digital Repository. There is no typing yet of the content, but in version 3, when it will come out, and there will be fanfare, I'm sure, have no doubt, because there will be an exciting paper about that. That information will have the entity linking module working. And so there will be an opportunity to really think about using the entity linking results in the version 3 of the data as a first step towards refining which words in the data set are actually toponyms and which are not.
I think as far as the metadata that can be delivered to a user, we have backend ways, and actually because we're using web annotation, which also IIIF does, all the content here is IIIF, and when you're on a result, you can get the data from that, and there's a way to make a call to get the web annotation data out of it, and we showed it in an earlier today, kind of the structure of that. It's a JSON structure, and that kind of content will be available. We're trying to make it exposed. Also, when people do edits, that will be exposed in that same information. So it won't necessarily be first you got the machine. We might have confirmation showing in there and things like that. Yeah.
All right, more questions from in the house? We still have one or two questions here. Here's a question about linking labels to the cartographic symbols. So are the labels linked to locations on the map's point, line, or polygon? If so, how is it done? I think the simple answer to that is not yet, but I know there's discussion of that. So who would be appropriate to answer that question? Probably you.
I can try because that's part of my PhD thesis many years ago. So, so this requires a couple different parts, right? So first we need to be able to recognize the text. Then we need to be able to do at least point symbols, line, and polygons very well. And we need to be able to use their spatial relationships, their semantic types. When I say semantic types, it's not saying specific types. I mean, for example, the font color, symbol size, visual cues of different symbols. We can cluster them. We can see how would be the perfect assignments within this map so that we can assign text labels to some features. And the final result would be, the ultimate goal would be, final result would be digitized layers of data with text labels. But we are very, very far away from that. So I think mainly right now the challenge is to figure out what are the things that we can do to already support humanity research, not to wait until someone has come up with a brilliant algorithm to be at the perfect result.
Final online question is, will other libraries be able to use these programs with their digitized map collections? I think that's a great one.
I mean, I think that one of the reasons we're here at this event is precisely to start working on generalizing the tools so that they can be refined for specific collections where it makes sense to use computational tools. If you have a collection of 500 maps, might not make sense. But if you have 100,000, it certainly does. And then I think what's really exciting is to just begin conversations with all of these libraries and indeed with researchers who might want to combine sort of composite collections, right? To do this. And in the morning session where we were talking a bit more about some of the technical scoping, we talked a lot about the importance of doing everything in the open, all the research being reproducible, of working with the communities who both curate these collections and are working to make them discoverable, and of really thinking about how we can partner with libraries going forward to make the most of what's been done already. So I hope the answer is yes to working with other collections. Yeah. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that.
One more in-house question there.
So that made me think. I'll ask the question no one wants to ask. For the open source, since this is all open source, are there any copyright concerns with working with maps that are still under copyright in some of these collections? And can they be surmounted so that we can use them?
I think David wants to address that. He's been rather involved with the archives.org.
Internet Archive. Is this on now? Okay. Well, coming out of the Internet Archive struggle, what we're seeing is even the judge that ruled against us in the archive versus the publishers, he said that if we were working with a large collection of materials, that would be a transformative use. He also said that taking an image, well, he didn't quite say image, but taking an image and transforming it, as we have done with all 57,000 that are georeferenced, that's transformative too. So those are two things that would weigh. It was definitely on my mind with my collection because I've got a lot of orphan works from now 1927 up to the present. But I think we're on good ground to eventually, I'd like to see us release the maps with the data sets so that people could work with them that way. Yeah.
All right. Do we have any other questions in house? Yes. Check.
I'm actually going to identify myself. I'm Abby Rumsey, and I am not going to ask a technical question. I'm going to ask particularly Yao Yi and his team whether they have they've talked to any colleagues in neuroscience, because there's of course a big field in the brain on reading. There's a big field on the brain and looking at art, but it seems to me that cartography is uniquely complex and has unique demands on the human brain. And I know you're not ready to show a lot of results yet in terms of visual things, but I'm just wondering when you want to inform neuroscientists that this is the work that you're doing and making huge progress, and it would be great for the humanities to bring them in as well. And incidentally, congratulations on the work that you've been doing.
Thank you. It's a pleasure meeting you. No, we haven't done that yet, but I think it would be great to have this type of collaboration, like what we have been thinking about. How do you take these machines that has lots of parameters to show it data so that you will be able to capture some patterns, at the same time, figure out what are the knowledge that human has and to use that as a context to facilitate that learning and recognition. So I think an important part of what our lab is working on is to recognize these two parts and to realize them in computer algorithms and implement them in a system. So it has been great working on this project. So thank you. Thank you, David. Yeah, but that's a great suggestion.
Any more questions?
One thing I noticed looking at a lot of these mosaics, if you will, is that they a lot of them, they're very tightly spaced texts, and I'm wondering if there was any consideration given to, the typical cartographic practice of spreading out the text, especially for things like mountain ranges, where it's even hard for a human sometimes to follow. So like Europe was the example given earlier, and that happens with continents as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can see so for our first delivery, almost all the widely spaced out labels got cut into pieces. But the second delivery with the improved machine learning model, the model started to pick up the spatial relationships between them. And our third delivery will address this problem with the utilization of some of the human annotation after we do post-processing on the human annotation. But still, I think one critical problem is still when we see some interesting example today, when you have multiple words and nothing in between, the machine will be able to capture that. But if you have another tiny label here, it won't be able to do it, right? But as a human, when you read it, not only you have this idea of this text and language, you also now know that you don't want to leave this character isolated. So that's one way that we are thinking about this problem. We call this post-OCR, for the lack of better terms, to be able to look at all these individual textual components in a complex document like map that without any structure. How do you take the text content and use their spatial relationship, use their font size, font type, visual cues to link each of them together so that we know, for example, those 4 characters belongs to one label or 2 words belongs to one label. And with this, we can also now say, now we all know the organization of all this. We can use some other machine learning model to help us better correct the recognition error than what we are doing right now is a fuzzy search. So our PhD student, Min Nam Kun, is working on this. She's here. We can.